the morning mist that clung to the bayous of southeast Texas in the spring of 1830. 6 carried the heavy scent of damp earth and the lingering smoke of a revolution that had only just quieted, marking the birth of a nation that was vast in territory yet fragile in spirit, a sprawling republic carved from the frontier where the promise of independence was tempered by the stark reality of survival. For the maps of the time depicted a massive claim of land stretching north and west, but the lived reality for the citizens of this new Republic of Texas was a daily navigation of uncertainty, dirt roads, and a horizon that seemed to stretch into eternity without a guarantee of safety or prosperity. To stand on the muddy banks of Buffalo Bayou in 1837 was to witness the audacious and somewhat chaotic birth of a city named for the hero of San Jacinto, Sam Houston, a place where canvas tents and rough-hewn log cabins sat uncomfortably alongside the grand aspirations of politicians who spoke of empire while slapping mosquitoes from their necks. And it was here in this humidity that the business of governance began, not in marble halls, but in wooden structures where the floorboards creaked under the weight of muddy boots and the air was thick with the smell of tobacco and urgency, a sensory overload that hinted at the desperation of a government with no money, a massive debt, and a population that was largely transient, consisting of adventurers, debtors, and families seeking a second chance in a land that did not ask too many questions about one's past. As you walked down what was ambitiously called Main Street in early Houston, you would not hear the roar of industry, but the sounds of construction and negotiation, the rhythmic thud of hammers striking green timber, the squelch of wagon wheels sinking into the notorious black mud that could swallow a boot whole, and the polyglot chatter of German immigrants, Tejanos, and American settlers from Tennessee and Kentucky, all trying to find their footing in an economy that was barely functional, a situation that created a peculiar tension where land was abundant but cash was almost non-existent, forcing a reliance on barter and credit that turned every transaction into a test of trust and reputation. This precarious financial state was perhaps the most defining struggle of the era, more constant than the threat of invasion. For the Republic had printed its own currency, known as Redbacks, which fluctuated so wildly in value that a single paper dollar might be worth only a few cents by the time a farmer reached the market, leading to scenes in general stores where the price of coffee or calico cloth was debated not in fixed terms, but in relation to the news of the day or the whim of the merchant, a subtle economic anxiety that underpinned every conversation and made the acquisition of hard coin a rare triumph. Yet, despite the poverty of the treasury, there was a richness in the social fabric that was weaving itself together, visible in the way communities gathered for log rollings or house raisings, events that were as much about survival as they were about socialization, where the labor of many hands could erect a shelter in a single day, followed by a meal of cornbread and roasted venison shared under the open sky, a moment of respite where the fiddle music might rise above the chirping of crickets, allowing the people to forget for a few hours that they were citizens of a country that many global powers did not yet believe would survive the decade. It was in these quiet moments, away from the bluster of the politicians, that the true character of the Republic was formed, in the resilience of women who managed homesteads while their husbands were away surveying land or sitting in the legislature, women who spun cotton, ground corn by hand, and educated their children with the few books that had survived the journey west, maintaining a semblance of civilization on the edge of the wilderness. And although the history books often focus on the great debates, one must wonder how often the future of the nation was actually decided at these dinner tables where the resolve to stay and build was hardened not by decrees, but by the simple act of enduring another season. The political landscape was dominated by two giants of opposing philosophies, Sam Houston and Mirabeau B. Lamar, whose visions for Texas were as different as the landscapes they favored. With Houston advocating for frugality, peace with the indigenous tribes, and eventual annexation by the United States, while Lamar dreamed of a Texan empire that would stretch to the Pacific, a grand ambition that led him to move the capital from the humidity of Houston to the edge of the frontier in 1839 to a settlement named Austin, nestled against the Colorado River and the violet crown of the hills, a location that was breathtakingly beautiful but perilously exposed, creating a new atmosphere of tension where legislators debated bills while keeping their rifles within arm's reach, a contrast between the pastoral beauty of the hill country and the ever-minus. E.T. The ever-minus present danger that defined the daily commute of the government clerk. To walk the streets of early Austin was to be in a place of stark contrasts, where the grand limestone buildings of the government rose from the dust, surrounded by simple cabins and the vast emptiness of the plains, a visual representation of Lamar's high-minded idealism clashing with the gritty reality of the frontier. And it was here that the famous Archives War would eventually unfold, not a battle of cannons, but a dispute over paper records, a moment of civil friction that revealed just how deeply the citizens felt about the location of their seat of power, proving that in this young republic, symbols mattered as much as safety. The roads that connected these disparate towns were little more than widened trails, carved by the hooves of horses and the iron rims of oxen carts, and travel was a slow, arduous process that could take weeks, exposing travelers to the elements and the sheer scale of the landscape, a journey that allowed for plenty of reflection on the isolation of the Texan experience, where a letter from a relative in Virginia might take months to arrive, if it arrived at all, making news from the outside world a precious commodity that was shared and dissected, in taverns and public squares with a hunger that modern minds can scarcely imagine. In the port city of Galveston, the atmosphere was different, filled with the salt air of the Gulf and the bustle of maritime trade, where ships arrived carrying manufactured goods from New Orleans and Europe, and departed heavy with bales of cotton, the white gold that drove the economy and fueled the dreams of planters who looked at the rich river bottomlands and saw not wilderness, but the potential for immense wealth, a vision that necessitated a complex and often troubled labor system. Yet for the average small farmer, the reality was one of subsistence, of planting corn and sweet potatoes, raising hogs that roamed semi-wild in the woods, and hoping that the rains would come at the right time, a connection to the land that was intimate and unforgiving. As the years of the Republic wore on, the initial euphoria of independence began to settle into a pragmatic realization that remaining a sovereign nation was expensive and dangerous, leading to a shift in public sentiment that saw the rise of the annexation movement, a political current that was less about surrendering identity and more about securing a future. For the debt was mounting, the currency was collapsing, and the diplomatic dance with international powers was exhausting, creating a sense of inevitability that rippled through the populace, a collective understanding that the lone star might shine brighter as part of a constellation rather than standing in solitary defiance. This period of transition was marked by intense debate in the newspapers of the time, such as the Telegraph and Texas Register, where editors spilled ink arguing the merits of sovereignty versus security, reflecting a literate and politically engaged citizenry that took their role in history seriously, gathering on porches and in meeting halls to hear speeches that lasted for hours, displaying an attention span and a passion for civic duty that anchored the democratic process even in the absence of formal institutions. The architecture of the time reflected this blend of permanence and transience, with the wealthy building Greek Revival homes that mimicked the styles of the Deep South, featuring wide columns and high ceilings to catch the breeze, while the majority lived in dog-trot cabins, distinctively Texan structures with a breezeway down the center to funnel the wind, a design born of necessity that remains an iconic symbol of the era. And if you visit parts of rural Texas today, you can still see the remnants of these structures, their weathered logs whispering stories of the families who slept within them, listening to the howling of the wind and the distant cry of coyotes. Education was a primary concern for leaders like Lamar, who famously declared that a cultivated mind is the guardian genius of democracy, setting aside vast tracts of land for the establishment of schools and a university, a forward-thinking move that laid the groundwork for the modern educational system, even if, at the time, few schools were actually built, leaving education largely in the hands of private tutors and mothers who taught their children to read by the light of tallow candles, instilling values of self-reliance and curiosity that would define the Texan character for generations. The cultural tapestry was also enriched by the presence of the Tejanos, whose deep roots in the region influenced the laws, the language, and the cattle culture that would eventually become synonymous with Texas, referring to the ranching techniques, the vocabulary of the corral, and the very concept of land grants, a heritage that was sometimes strained by political changes, but remained an indelible part of the Republic's identity, reminding everyone that this land had a history long before 1836. Religion played a stabilizing role as well, with circuit-riding preachers traveling hundreds of miles on horseback to bring sermons to isolated settlements, holding camp meetings that drew families from counties away, creating temporary tent cities where spiritual revival mixed with social gathering, offering a release from the grinding hardship of daily labor and providing a moral compass in a land where the rule of law was often difficult to enforce. By the time 1845 arrived, the mood had shifted from the defensive stance of the early years, to a cautious optimism about the prospect of joining the United States, a momentous decision that was ratified by the voters and celebrated with a mixture of relief and nostalgia, for as the flag of the Republic was lowered for the last time in a solemn ceremony in Austin, many eyes were wet with tears, not of regret, but of reverence for the decade of struggle that had forged a unique people, a sentiment captured by President Anson Jones when he declared that the final act in the great drama was performed, a line that signaled the end of an era, but the beginning of a legacy that persists to this day. Even now, as you drive the paved highways that overlay the old wagon trails, or walk the streets of downtown Houston, where glass skyscrapers stand on the foundations of those early log cabins, or visit the bustling grandeur of the current state capitol, which sits near the site of that original wooden outpost, you can sense the ghost of the Republic, a spirit of independence and grit that permeates the culture, visible in the pride of the people and the distinctive shape of the map, a reminder that for 10 tumultuous years, this was a separate nation, born of mud and ambition, which voluntarily chose a new path while never forgetting the solitary star that once flew alone against the vast, open sky. The legacy of the Republic is not just in the names of the counties or the statues in the town squares, but in the enduring mythology of the frontier, a time when a trip to the store was an expedition and a letter was a treasure, and as the sun sets over the Brazos today, casting long shadows across the cotton fields that still bloom in the heat, one can almost hear the creak of the ox carts and the murmur of voices discussing the price of land in a currency that no longer exists, a continuous loop of memory that binds the modern Texan to the pioneer of 1845, ensuring that the story of those 10 years remains not just a chapter in a textbook, but a living, breathing part of the American narrative. The transition from republic to state was seamless in law but complex in emotion, for it required a people who had defined themselves by their solitude to embrace a broader union, a psychological shift that was eased by the economic stability that followed, as the United States military took over the burden of frontier defense, and the Postal Service connected the remote towns to the rest of the continent, bringing an end to the extreme isolation that had characterized the previous decade. Yet the distinct Texan identity remained, a cultural artifact that had been hardened in the kiln of the Republic years. It is worth remembering the sensory details of that final year, the 1845th year, when the annexation resolution was the talk of every town, how the newspapers were passed from hand to hand until they were tattered and unreadable, how the debates in the taverns became less about if and more about when, and how the anticipation of change brought a strange stillness to the land, as if the very prairie was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter to begin, a pause that felt heavy with history. In the evenings, families would gather on their porches, watching the fireflies dance in the tall grass, discussing what it would mean to be American again, or for the first time. And while the political machinery in Washington and Austin churned, the daily rhythms of life continued. The cows still needed milking, the fences needed mending, and the corn needed harvesting, grounding the lofty political changes in the undeniable reality of sweat and soil. The diplomatic maneuvering that took place in the courts of Europe, where envoys from Texas tried to secure loans and recognition from France and Britain, added a layer of international intrigue to the story, with foreign dignitaries struggling to understand the rough and tumble nature of Texan politics, sending home dispatches that described a land of immense potential but bewildering customs, a perspective that highlights just how unique this experiment in self-governance truly was. We must also consider the silence of the vast spaces between the settlements, the miles of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush that bloomed every spring regardless of who claimed the land, the thunderstorms that rolled across the plains with a violence that shook the walls of the cabins, and the immense, starry nights that offered a canopy of wonder to people who had little else in the way of entertainment, a natural grandeur that surely seeped into the souls of the inhabitants, giving them a sense of scale and possibility that is reflected in the Texan ethos of thinking big. As the era of the Republic closed, the physical traces of the time began to evolve, with the log cabins slowly being replaced by lumber milled in the expanding sawmills of East Texas, the muddy trails being surveyed for better roads, and the population swelling as the certainty of American annexation unleashed a new wave of immigration, transforming the demographic landscape and setting the stage for the rapid growth that would follow in the 1850s. Yet, if one looks closely at the foundations of the older towns, at the layout of the streets in San Antonio or the ferry crossings on the Trinity River, the blueprint of the Republic is still visible, a skeletal structure upon which the modern state is built, proving that while flags may change, the underlying geography and the human patterns of settlement possess a stubborn continuity. The story of Texas from 1836 to 1845 is ultimately a human story, not of soldiers and statesmen alone, but of the shopkeeper in Colombia who extended credit when he knew he shouldn't, of the mother in Gonzales who taught her son to respect the land, of the surveyor who walked 1,000 miles to map a future he might not live to see, and of the collective will of a diverse group of people who, for a brief moment in history, held the reins of their own destiny in a way few ever do, creating a legacy that feels as tangible today as the limestone blocks of the old land office in Austin. As we reflect on this time, the loop of history brings us back to the present, where the independent spirit of that decade echoes in the way business is done, in the pride of local governance, and in the simple, stubborn refusal to be anything other than Texan, a sentiment that was forged in the days of the Redback dollar and the muzzle-loading rifle, leaving us with a realization that the Republic never truly disappeared, but rather absorbed itself into the heart of the people, living on as a quiet, steady beat beneath the noise of the modern world.